everybody. Thanks for joining me for another one-man review. Today I'll be taking a look at 20 Kilometers per Hour by Woshibai. This is a new release from Drawn and Quarterly. Just came out, just got it in the mail. Really enjoyed this book. It's a collection of short stories by Woshibai, who is a underground cartoonist in China, which is, first off, I'm just really curious about what that scene is. First off, I don't know much about the mainstream industry in China, much less an underground scene. So anyone who has any information on that, I would love to know it. Beautifully produced book, lots of nice use of tones in there. And then one thing that I really like about this is this like half soft cover, half hardcover format. It's like just a really sturdy soft cover book. I think this is perfect for a book like this that's a collection of short stories. When it's in hardcover, it really feels like this is a chunk of stuff. Like this chunk of stuff all goes together and I don't know, it's important or something like that is what hardcover feels like to me. Softcover feels too throwaway. It's too unstable and gets beat up too easy, as I noticed that this is already beat up. But I feel like this format makes it feel special and important, and it feels really nice to hold it. It's got a nice curved binding, and it really allows for the book to flex and get some, I mean, in this book it doesn't really matter, but you get some really like laying flat in the binding where you don't get any gutter loss. So this is a format I really like. I've seen Fantagraphics do it once or twice, but I think more people should start considering this. If anyone knows like price-wise where this fits in between softcover and hardcover in terms of producing it, that would be interesting as well. But I feel like this is a good way to keep costs a little bit lower while putting out a sturdier book that looks and feels nice. It doesn't just look, you know, like another trade on the shelf. So all that's really cool. The content of the story the stories are also really fun. I think this is a very playful artist who's a really strong composer, someone who seems to be interested in kind of systems and rules to some extent. So the poetics of form show up in here, but that's always couched under stories, and the stories usually have multiplicity of interpretation as well. So I read through this all in one night, just flipped through it real quick. But I do think the ideal reading for this book is to go through one story at a time and just really contemplate it. So I'll give a couple example stories of like the general kind of vibes that cycle in this book, the different kind of more poetics of form stuff, the humorous stuff, the playful stuff, and that should give a good sense of the book. The stories are always told in these like kind of 2 panels per page, so there's that systematic nature throughout the whole book. And then there's always kind of some physical mechanics going on, like this story here, Old Bottle. First off, you can see great composition with great rhythm, really good use of just space and shape and form in the compositions, but also a good kind of animatic sense of physics that drives a lot of the story. So here you have like this bottle runs, dunks itself in the water, fills itself up, and runs back. Composition's great all throughout. Is going to run back to, I don't know, probably quench this man's thirst who's dying in the forest, and then trips and cracks and breaks open just short of being able to save this guy. So that's the punchline. Actually, when I first read this story, my assumption for some reason when I got here is that this bottle was trying to set this guy up and actually threw itself on the ground in front of him. I think that what you're supposed to get out of this is it was trying to save the guy and it fell just short of the goal. But these stories have this kind of multiplicity of interpretation built into them, and that's why I say I think it would be best to buy this book and read it one story at a time and think about all the different interpretations, why you came to the assumption, like why did I think that this was a bottle trying to set up a guy to make it look like he was passed out because he was drunk rather than a bottle that was trying to save a guy. It says a lot about me. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in these types of stories for reflection, and I think that's a little bit of what Woshibai is trying to do with the stories. So that, I think I'll go back to the book and treat it like that, just like a one a day meditative kind of thing would probably be the ideal reading experience. There's a lot of formal play as well in terms of just like the formal mechanics of images on a flat paper being ambiguous. I think ambiguity is part of the stories and part of the images. So here you're taking advantage of the fact that when things are flattened out, scale gets funny, and you can use that for forced perspective tricks, and this is a forced perspective trick here. We all know that the moon isn't the size of a quarter, but in our visual field, if we think about it as a flat plane, it's the size of the quarter. So here you have a guy who's trying to buy something out of a vending machine, doesn't have any money in his pockets, and reaches up and just grabs the moon out of the sky and uses it as a quarter. So that's taking advantage of the spatial ambiguity, but I think there's also some narrative ambiguity here that comes with the spatial ambiguity of when you see it, it looks like a quarter. So did this guy pull a magic trick and pull the moon out of the sky and put it into the machine, which seems to be narratively the most obvious thing. That seems to be what's presented. But you could also think like someone just stuck a quarter to the window and he happens to notice the quarter stuck to the window, which is the more realistic thing, but for some reason is the less obvious and less likely thing in terms of the story. The mysticism of the story seems to make more sense than the realistic idea that someone like stuck a quarter to the window. And that's, again, this kind of idea that I think these are a bit like these little poems for meditation. I think that's what these are about, that the ambiguities in them are supposed to make you think things. I also think that Woshibai is a very playful artist and wants to engage with the world in a playful way. I think these stories do that to some extent, but he's also, I shouldn't say he, I don't know. The artist is also kind of like telling stories that suggest at other fun activities you could engage in. So this one, I wouldn't encourage the theft and the breaking in, but the general idea in this story is really fun and really speaks to me and is the kind of thing I would still like to do because it's someone trying to create wonder in the world. So they're breaking in and stealing all of these pages and then compiling them and binding them into a book and then sneaking it into a bookstore or a library. Now, like I said, I wouldn't recommend going in and stealing pages, but I really, really like the idea of getting a bunch of old books, pulling pages out, and then binding a new book out of them, and then just going and putting it in a library or a used bookstore or something like that. Anything that has like a golden ticket, just stumble upon it. What in the world is this thing that I found? I just always really like those kind of engagements with the world, these kind of little things where you cause a break in someone's day-to-day life. You make them stop and look at their greater surrounding and question what's going on. You bring a little bit of surreality into reality. And I think this story in here, A, it's something I would really like to do. It's a great idea. B, it's just another indication of the spirit of the artist that's making this work, that these kind of are these playful little incursions that are trying to get you to break and question reality, like with these spatial ambiguities and things like that. I think that's the driving ethic behind this artist. Here's another one. You see the sense of humor, and I won't show the whole story because it has a funny little twist ending to it, I think, that I wouldn't want to spoil. But there's also just the power of like a comedian or a New Yorker cartoonist that's able to make these observations about the absurdity of the world, which is another way to cause people to break with reality for a second, right? That when you make an observation about the way things work and you're like, but this is silly, that breaks things. So like this panel here could have been a New Yorker cartoon. This woman just looking at it, take the title of the story, which is missing, and just put it on the poster, which is obviously a missing poster for a leaf. And I think you have a really good one-off cartoon. Like, what an absurd thing for someone to do, post a missing poster for a leaf. But Woshibai has the ability, because they're working in comics rather than just a single panel of cartoon, to play out the consequences of those absurd ideas. And I think that's really interesting as well, this idea of taking that one-off kind of joke that you would make and then playing it out more like a comedian would over a set or something like that. I think this book has that in it as well. And again, it's this break with reality. So this is a really funny story, this woman who's trying to help someone find their missing leaf. I don't want to spoil that. There's one, when we're talking about just kind of pure formal elements and principles of art, where color gets introduced just one time in the book. I thought that was really interesting and gave the artist an opportunity to add a different element into their work. And I think this is, hopefully something that they continue to explore because it's very impactful. I like it. And then here you see where things get more invested in just the systematic, almost concept art nature of things, like a Solowit rule-based concept art, or John Baldessari Ed Ruscha, like photographing the whole strip, the Hilda and Hilda and Bern Becker going around and photographing every water tower they could find. It has that kind of conceptual art, rule-based stuff to it. And the book with the 2-panel tiers kind of feels like it has a system behind it, but I don't know what it is. But there is a real sense of like tight mathematical systemization, at least in the construction of the compositions or something. And this story speaks to that tendency within the artist's personality, I think. So here's sorting, and you see this character just going and cutting out punctuation marks from a book and then gluing them into their own book, and then just has a whole collection of cut out punctuation marks. And that's really compelling to me, like someone who's a designer, who's a real fetishist for, font and like letter type design, typeface design, could get really obsessed with these things and create a collection for themselves, and that's interesting. But also there's something more about the obsessive behavior of those kinds of activities that's really compelling to me, even though it's a bit cuckoo pants. So this story, I think, is like the other element that's hard to describe in the book, but it gives a sense of something in the author's personality that shows up in a significant amount of stories for me. This interest in the very, very simple elements that go into making images and making comics tick. So that's a really cool story. And again, this idea of like stumbling into someone's house who has this collection, or that one of these books would get put in a library somewhere and someone would stumble across it, is really interesting. So really enjoyed this book. I think this is an artist with a really kind of unique perception on the world, someone who's encoding that in images, and it's a really worthwhile book to pick up. Like I said, if you do get it, or if you've got it and you haven't read it yet, I would encourage reading it one piece at a time and really contemplating each piece. I think that's where the real power of this work comes from. You could go through it like a collection of cartoons and just go through it in about 20 minutes and be done with it, and I think you'd be cheating yourself. I think there's more to it than that. So really cool book. Really like that Drawn and Quarterly is bringing over some underground artists from other countries, other scenes. That's really cool. Like I said, I'd be curious to know about both the mainstream and the underground scene in China. To even think that there's underground artists operating in China just seems strange to me, given at least the public narrative about control and stuff in China that we get here in the US. So it makes me just very curious about what else is out there, and I really appreciate companies like Drawn and Quarterly, like Glacier Bay Books, like Fantagraphics, some of the projects Sean's doing with Living the Line, that are bringing over these important, harder to find works, less accessible works from people in other countries. I think is a really great agenda. So buy the book, enjoy it. It's a very cool book. I'd love to hear what kind of insights people get from it when they contemplate these stories. If you enjoy what we're doing here on the channel and you want to support us, there's 2 ways to do that. The first one is through our Patreon. There's 2 tiers of access on the Patreon. At the first tier, you just get early access to our videos. At the second tier, you get exclusive access to images from the books that Sean and I are working on, our private projects, as well as sketches and things like that show up every now and then. You also get exclusive access to our ongoing Prane Day web strip, which is an experiment in AI, and you can help vote to determine what happens with that story. Any of the money that we make on Patreon just goes back into buying the books that we review. So we really appreciate that help, and that helps us keep you in books to consider. If you want to support Living the Line itself, the best thing to do is support what Sean's doing with Living the Line Publishing. So we'll go ahead and take a look at one of his projects now. Plaza by Yokoyama Yuichi. This is translated by Ryan Holmberg and is very large for a manga, so that's a really cool feature of this book, this standard manga size. And this is just a 200 some odd page representation of what Yokoyama Yuichi thinks of the Carnival Parade, and he's just made this like relentlessly loud and rhythmic book that pushes all kinds of amazing boundaries of what comics and manga are, and we could not recommend this book more. Thanks for following along. Take it away, Jack.